Everybody for this evening's program. So welcome everyone, now that I see we're recording, and take it away, Gabe.
Well, let me add my welcome and Happy New Year to everyone. I'm Gabriel Meyer, the Executive Director of the Ruskin Art Club, Los Angeles' oldest arts association, now in its 134th year. This is our inaugural event of the 2022 season, and we're delighted you all could join us tonight. One of the themes of this year's programming, as those of you who've looked at the latest newsletter know, will be Ruskin beyond the Anglosphere. That is, Ruskin's often little-known influence on aesthetic thought in non-English speaking countries, France and Japan, for example. It's now my great pleasure to turn things over to our Ruskin Art Club board member and colleague, Sarah Atwood. In addition to serving on our board of directors, Sarah is co-director with Jim Spates of the Ruskin Society of North America and a companion of the Guild of St. George, Ruskin's charity, founded in 1871. She has lectured widely on Ruskin, both in the US and abroad, focusing particularly on education, the environment, and language. Regulars at these lectures will remember Sarah's penetrating talk on Ruskin and Emerson last May, which is posted, as all our events are, on our Ruskin Art Club YouTube channel. She has also written on the topic we're considering tonight, Ruskin and France, including an essay published in the review 19th Century Prose in 2017. When she's not lecturing about Ruskin, she's a lecturer in English literature and writing at Portland Community College. Sarah. Whoop.
You're muted, I'm afraid.
Yep. Sorry about that. So thank you, Gabriel, and thank you to Ruskin Art Club and to Gabriel for inviting me to moderate tonight's event. I'm really delighted to be here. It's a pleasure to meet Damian. So thank you for being here as well. I'm really looking forward to your talk. I'm just going to get right to introducing Damian. Damian has translated more than 40 books from German, Norwegian, French, and Dutch, including a translation of Proust's On Reading, published together with the essay by Ruskin that Proust was translating and annotating. He's received writing and translating awards, including a Guggenheim, Cullman Center, and NEA fellowships, the major English and American German to English translation prizes, and the Federal Order of Merit from the German government. He abridged Henry David Thoreau's The Journal for New York Review Books Classics. His own work includes poetry in the Paris Review, a book of short stories, a history of the Rorschach test, and biography of its creator that has been translated into 10 languages, and which now I'm going to have to go and find because that sounds fascinating to me, and a forthcoming book called The Philosophy of Translation. So welcome, Damian. We look forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks. Thank you, Sarah. And Gabriel for making this happen, and the Ruskin Arts Club. It's delightful for me to be talking to you all. I'm used to talking about this material to Proust people, where I have to explain who John Ruskin is. And I don't have to explain who Proust is and what he was doing. I can presuppose that people are interested in that. So, I usually say something like, Ruskin was a monstrous cross between William James, Henry David Thoreau, and John Singer Sargent, and wait for people to shake their heads and sort of leave it at that. Like maybe I'll mention the funeral where hundreds of thousands of mourners turned out to convey that he was an important person. But then I focus pretty much entirely on Proust. Here it's different since you probably all know more about Ruskin than I do. And I also don't know how familiar with or interested in Proust per se you might be. Then again, I've just heard that a bunch of people from the Proust Society of Los Angeles are supposed to be here. So bonjour to all of you. And now I really don't know where to pitch exactly what I'm going to say. But, you know, the description of the talk that lured you all here said that I was going to talk about Proust. And the fact that it's the Ruskin Art Club means that I do want to say something about what this interaction or dialogue tells us about Ruskin. It's easy enough to say how Proust reads Ruskin tells us about Proust. I'm a translator, so I'm used to thinking about how the translation process reflects on the translator. As Sarah mentioned, I've written a book on the Rorschach test. So how you see things does in fact say something about who you are. I haven't before in public ever had to really clarify what it tells us about Ruskin. So that's what I'm gonna try and do along the way on this Proust talk. I'll have three ways that looking at the two of these figures together tells us something about Ruskin. But to start, let me give you some of the historical basics about the connection. For anyone who doesn't know, Proust was born in 1871, and by 1897, he was stuck as a writer. He had written about 1,000 pages, which for Proust is not that much, of an attempted novel called Jean Santoy, but he was stuck. He didn't know how to pull it together or what exactly he was doing. And at that point in 1897, he read a long article that later became a long book in French called Ruskin and the Religion of Beauty. And he got into Ruskin. He started studying Gothic architecture. He took lots of Ruskin-inspired pilgrimages, which a lot of people did, especially before there was art photography in art history books that you could look at. So if you wanted to go see Giotto, you had to go to Italy and see Giotto. You weren't going to see it anywhere else. And he started reading Ruskin extensively and writing articles about him. So in his late 20s, Ruskin for Proust was a figure very analogous to a more well-known pairing, what Rodin, the sculptor, was for Rilke, the poet, in his late 20s. In both cases, you have this older mentor who advocates kind of creativity through submission, submitting to something greater, and concrete attention to physical sculptural form. For Ruskin, it's about the Gothic cathedrals. For Rodin, of course, it's sculpture. And in both cases, the sort of dreamy and frustrated younger artist gained the discipline and confidence that he needed to sort of construct more solid forms, you might say, metaphorically, out of the words they were writing with. There's even the coincidence that they each sort of famously took a slogan from their mentor figure, and it's almost the same slogan. So Proust likes to quote Ruskin saying, "Work while you still have light." And Rilke likes to quote Rodin saying, "Travailler, grande travailler, work, always work, nothing but work." So that was this figure that Ruskin was for Proust. And he claimed by early 1900, this is Proust, to know by heart, whatever that exactly means, Seven Lamps of Architecture, Bible of Amiens, Lectures on Literature and Painting, Val d'Arnaud, and the autobiography Praeterita, which is almost 600 pages long, and which I now realize I've never actually heard anyone say, so I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. Maybe someone can tell me if I'm not. So that is where Proust was. He ended up spending about 8 years, starting in 1897, really devoted to Ruskin, and he spent 6 years translating 2 of Ruskin's books into French. These were the first 2 book-length translations of Ruskin ever into French. The first one was the Bible of Amiens, and here's how Proust described it, but admittedly in a pitch to a publisher, so maybe take some of the praise with a little bit of a grain of salt. But he says, beautiful, unknown, and original, the finest of Ruskin's works, Ruskin's only book to do with France, being simultaneously about French history, a French city, and the French Gothic style. So going into French, it does make sense to have that book come first. And as I'm sure most of you know, the Bible of Amiens is the cathedral, and in particular, its west portal. So Ruskin reads this Bible in order to get the lessons our fathers have told us. This was going to be book 1 of a 10-book series called Our Father Has Told Us. Our fathers have told us. And then Ruskin did not end up doing that. But I imagine that one of the things Proust liked about this was that it turned architecture into reading, and Proust had a very reading-centered imagination even when it wasn't bookish. So the Bible of Amiens is Ruskin talking about architecture and reading it like a book. So he translates it. And I should probably say at some point, now's probably a good time, a little bit about Proust's translations, because he famously didn't really know English that well. He sort of couldn't order a meal in a restaurant, or he didn't really speak it. And in fact, there's a story that must be apocryphal, although I seem to remember having found out that it really did happen, but I don't believe it. So I'm going to call it apocryphal, which is that Proust was in his publisher's office and sort of overheard someone in the halls being like, oh, that Proust guy is going to do a terrible translation because he doesn't know English. And he draws himself up and says, I do not claim to know English. I claim to know Ruskin. And in fact, his translations did win very high praise, both from the English and from the French, for being beautiful and true and capturing the spirit of the original and being good translations. What he literally did was have someone else sort of prepare a first draft that he then heavily revised. The 2 main people who did that for him were, first of all, his mother, and secondly, this woman named Marie Nordlinger, who was from Rushholm, where Ruskin gave the lectures, and Proust was very happy about that. But I just want to bring it up because I think a lot of people hear this and kind of blame Proust for like cheating or something. And that's not really how it works. You know, I have also translated from languages that I don't know perfectly, and even some that I couldn't order a meal in a restaurant or call a cab, you know, verbally and feel comfortable doing it. But that's not the skill you need as a translator. You need to be able to read what this text is that you're reading, have some sensitivity for if you're missing something, and then you can just go ask a native speaker or check another dictionary, or, you know, find out what the nuance is that you can tell is there, but you're not quite sure what it is. And then the main skill is being able to write in English if you're translating into English, or French if you're translating into French. I mean, you're producing a book in that language. Proust was producing a book in French, and it kind of mattered more that he was a good writer in French up to the level of producing Ruskin-style writing. So I personally, for my own reasons, defend Proust against these charges that like, oh, it's going to be terrible because he doesn't know English well enough. Well, turns out it wasn't terrible. He actually did a very beautiful and good job. So in any case, he's deciding he doesn't know English, but he knows Ruskin, and he's going to translate the two books. The first is Bible of Amiens. It comes out, his father dies in 1903. And so rather than sort of shifting back into fiction writing as he perhaps might have done, he was grieving and did another translation instead of Sesame and Lilies, which as he's finishing it, his mother dies. And this is much more devastating for him. And after Sesame and Lilies comes out in 1906, he turns down more offers to translate Ruskin. Even St. Mark's Rest, the book about Venice, which of course Proust had connected with via Ruskin very seriously. He turns down the translation projects. He's kind of devastated for a couple years. But then in 1908, in some notebooks, he starts the process that's going to lead to Remembrance of Things Past. So that's the trajectory historically or biographically of Proust translating Ruskin. And it leaves us with these two books. They have a pretty different feel to them, the translations, I mean. In a way I'll talk about in a second. But there are also some similarities. And the main similarity is that Proust really does make these books his own. He writes a very long preface to each of the books that is anything that is certainly not just sort of giving biographical information and kind of modestly doing a secondary essay on Ruskin. That's very much a Proust piece in different ways in the two books. And then the other thing he does is add tons and tons of footnotes, like literally hundreds of footnotes that sometimes totally swallow up the page. So I'm going to just show you, this is the French edition of Sesame and Lilies. And here's some pages where you can't read it, but you can see the footnotes on the bottom are like the whole page. And then here's the next page. Again, like all of this is footnotes. Here's the next page. I think this is where we might get the like 4-page footnote on Metterlink. Like here's the huge footnote that's just continuing on and on and on. And some of these are footnotes about Metterlink, about Parisian respiratory doctors, about like all this Proust stuff that it's kind of bizarre that he's putting on the bottom of a page of Ruskin. Proust, in all of his works really liked or needed to find these kind of accordioning structures that could just expand as much as he wanted to stretch them. Remembrance of Things Past, as you may know, it's 7 volumes, but the first version he wrote was 3 volumes, which were sort of the beginning and the end. And then as he revised it, especially during the delay caused by World War I, he filled in more and more and more in the middle so that volumes 1, 2, and 3 became sort of 1, 2, and 7, and there was like more stuff piled in. The first book he published, called Pleasures and Days, consists of more than 50 little bits that are all just kind of grouped together. And the only other book he published in his lifetime, called Pastiche et Mélange, is 9 pastiches of other writers and a mélange of 8 completely disparate, totally heterogeneous texts. So Proust really worked by finding some structure that he could continue adding more into the middle of. And when it didn't work, it would turn out to just be a grab bag. And so he needed to find, as he eventually would in Remembrance of Things Past, a structure that would contain all these different things and in a way unify them. So the fact that he's just going to pile in more and more footnotes into his Ruskin translations is very typical of him in general. But he also came up with what I really can only call a crazy scheme of what he was going to do with these footnotes that he talks about in the preface that he writes to his translation of Bible of Damian. And kind of typically for Proust, he starts with something that's a very true, smart point, and then kind of unpacks it and draws consequences until it's something completely nuts. But he's sort of explained it out for you step by step. And so what he does is he says, well, you can't really judge an artist of any type from just one work. For example, if you're looking at a Rembrandt portrait, you don't know what is the Rembrandtness and what is just a reflection of the person he's painting a portrait of. You can't tell, you know, what's essential to the artist and what is particular to this project. So on the other hand, if you look at a bunch of Rembrandt portraits, you get to see the Rembrandtness. And in fact, the critic's job is to help you, viewer, see the Rembrandtness by looking at all these different portraits together. Now that's a smart point, and it's, you know, true. I think most of us would agree with it. And he says, well, so this is a problem for if you're translating the first book by John Ruskin into a new language. So what I'm going to do, Proust, what I'm going to do is every time, you know, I have all of Ruskin memorized. So every time I read a passage in this book that reminds me of something from another Ruskin book, I'll translate that and put it in the footnote for you so that you, French reader, as you're reading along, will have like a fake version of remembering all of Ruskin and having it all come back to you. It won't really be your memory because you've never been able to read Ruskin before because none of these other books are translated, but you'll have my version that I will have sort of cobbled together for you so that you will have the holistic, I'm reading multiple books of Ruskin experience. And what he calls this is a makeshift memory. So all of these footnotes are very explicitly, he says in the preface, this is what he's doing. I'm creating a makeshift memory for all you monolingual readers, which won't work as well as if it was really your memory with your associations and your subjectivity, but it will still kind of work. I want to just make a brief translation digression here because makeshift memory is always translated wrong by everyone that I've seen, at least before I published a translation of this, and I haven't kept up, so maybe everyone's still doing it wrong. The French word is mémoire improvisée. So of course it's translated as improvised memory. But that's not what it is. It's not like a jazz solo. It's not sort of creative and spontaneous as the phrase improvised memory suggests. What it really is kind of cobbled together and not as good and not, you know, constructed properly. Makeshift is the right word. It's not an improvised memory. It's a makeshift memory. And the translators were just fooled by the false friend of improvisé must be improvised. Okay, so this is what I mean by kind of brilliant but crazy, right? Like I'm gonna put footnotes in this book of like all the other random stuff that I have, you know, that popped into my head while I was reading this book. And so you'll feel like all this stuff is popping into your head too. And the way he sort of justifies it is talking about Ruskin's coherence, the sort of coherence of Ruskin's work as a whole, that it's always the same minded work and it's sort of at work in the same kind of way. So it's this kind of big holistic thing that you can dip into the different parts of and have it all be coherent. I'll come back to this idea, which is again quite strange, a little bit later. So, okay, I've talked about Bible of Amiens, Sesame and Lilies. As again, I'm sure most of you know, Sesame and Lilies is 2 lectures, chummily referred to as the Sesame lecture and the Lilies lecture, but they have their own titles, of King's Treasuries, and it's S apostrophe, so the treasury of kings in the plural, of King's Treasuries and of Queen's Gardens. Later editions have a 3rd lecture, but Proust doesn't translate it, and I don't care about it either. And the sort of the diptych is really nice of the kings and the queens, so we'll just forget about the 3rd one. And the King's Treasuries is a lecture on reading. Those treasuries are, in fact, books. And Sesame is, among other things, the magical open sesame of Alibaba that unlocks the treasuries. And so any book, you just by reading it can pronounce the open sesame and gain access to these treasures yourself. On Queen's Gardens is a lecture about women's education that Proust is certainly less interested in. His preface is all about reading. He has many more notes on the Sesame lecture than the Lilies lecture. And I don't know quite what to make of it either. I have read takes that it's this very progressive, feminist, pro-women's education lecture, which it is. On the other hand, it also seems to me as a 21st century reader quite dated and condescending and pretty sexist about, let the little ladies have their pretty flowers and tend to the Queen's gardens. And, the King's Treasuries is where the action really is. Certainly is the sense that I get as a reader from reading these lectures. And Proust didn't engage much in the Queen's Gardens either. So I'm going to leave that lecture aside for the rest of what I'm going to talk about. The main difference between Proust's versions of Bible of Amiens and Sesame and Lilies is that Proust has gotten a lot farther as a writer and thinker and spirit, if you want to put it that way. By the time of Sesame and Lilies, he has really figured out where he stands, and he's kind of found these key Proustian techniques to the point where the preface he writes to Sesame and Lilies, which is called On Reading, really is starting to be remembrance of things past in miniature. For anyone out there who in fact hasn't read Remembrance of Things Past, I'm going to say something I've said to many people over the years, which is, don't be intimidated by it being a 3,000-page book, because if you just read the first 150 pages, you're going to get the Proust experience. So if you like the first 150, great, there's more where that came from. But if you feel like you want to read Proust but are scared off, then just think of it as a 150-page book. Those first 150 pages are an overture, and then a section about his fictionalized hometown as a child, Cambrai being the fictional name. And the preface on reading to the Ruskin book is, in fact, half a totally fictionalized description of being a child reading an exciting book in Cambrai that could almost come straight out of Remembrance of Things Past, followed by a more sober, reasonable, like, John Ruskin wrote these lectures and here's what they say and here's my argument kind of thing. But he actually does his, Proust at his best stuff for the first time in his life in this introduction about reading. I think I'm doing okay enough for time that I can even read a little Proust, which isn't Ruskin, but I'm sure everyone would rather hear Proust than me. Although I'm cheating because I translated it, so you are hearing me anyway. Yeah, let me just read you the end of the Bible of Amiens preface and the end of the Sesame and Lilies preface. And you can see the shift very clearly because the first is very sort of despairing and pessimistic about how it's impossible to recapture lost time. And then in the second, he's learned how to do it. And that's what he's going to carry forth. So at the end of the Bible of Amiens preface, he says, not being able to reawaken the flames of the past, we want to at least gather its ashes. It is when Ruskin is far from our heart that we translate his books and set out to portray the lineaments of his thought in a faithful image. So perhaps you will not be able to hear the sounds of our faith or our love. Perhaps it is only our piety you can perceive here and there, cold and furtive, and busy like the Theban virgin restoring a tomb. He is a lot more positive at the end of the Sesame and Lilies preface. Here's the whole paragraph. How many times in the Divine Comedy, in Shakespeare, have I had the impression of coming face to face with a little of the past inserted into an hour of the present? The same dreamlike impression you have in Venice on the Piazzetta before the two gray and pink granite columns which bear atop their Greek capitals the Lion of St. Mark on one, St. Theodore treading upon the crocodile on the other. Two handsome foreigners from the East come from across the sea that they now watch from a distance, the sea that comes to die at their feet. Both of them, without understanding the conversations conducted around them in a language different from that of their homeland, on this public square where their remote and distracted smile still glitters, continue to prolong among us their days from the 12th century that they have intercalated into our days of today. Yes, in the middle of this public square, in the midst of the present day whose reign it here interrupts, a little of the 12th century, vanished so long ago, rises up in a thin double surge of pink granite. Everywhere around us, the present days, the days we live, circulate, crowd around the columns, buzz with activity, but then suddenly stop and take flight like bees we have brushed aside. For those high, thin storehouses of the past are not in the present, they are in another time into which the present cannot penetrate. All around those pink columns that shoot up toward their broad capitals, the days of the present crowd and buzz, but the columns inserted among them brush them aside, defining with their slender impenetrability the inviolable terrain of the past, a past which has surged familiarly into the midst of the present, which has the slightly unreal look of things that a kind of illusion makes us see as though they were a few steps away, when in fact they are many centuries away. Their whole appearance, aimed a bit too directly at the mind, exalting it a little, as one would expect from a ghost arisen from a buried time. Nonetheless, there, in our midst, approachable, crowded round, felt, unmoving in the sun. So yeah, he figured it out at some point between Ruskin Book 1 and Ruskin Book 2, how to bring the past back to life. There's even, there's 5 things that he sort of equates or makes metaphors for each other. There's Dante's or Shakespeare's presence in the reader. There's the columns in the square of Venice. There's the Eastern artifacts in the West, in Europe. There's the 12th century in the present. And there's his personal memories of Venice in his present writing of the preface. Unlike in the first passage I read, where you have to keep them separate because you can't write about Ruskin if you're really thinking about Ruskin, here you can bring your experience of Venice into your writing about Venice, the same way all these other things can be brought in. So, so that's Sesame and Lilies. And now that Proust's sort of own position is sharper, he also kind of takes a sharper line on Ruskin, and really just disagrees and argues against Ruskin's idea of reading from the very beginning. So Ruskin gives an epigram to his Sesame lecture, which is Lucian saying, "You shall each have a cake of sesame and 10 pound." And then Proust adds a 3-page note saying, well, Ruskin went through a bunch of different possible epigraphs to this Sesame lecture. But here's why he picked this one, and here's how it works. So now I'm going to read you some more Proust, but this is Proust as the secondary source. This is Proust now analyzing and giving quite a good analysis of how Ruskin works. Having given his lecture the symbolic title of Sesame, the Sesame of the 1001 Nights, the magic word which opens the door to the thieves' cave, as an allegory of reading, which opens for us the door of those treasuries where the most valuable wisdom of men is stored up, books, Ruskin amused himself by taking up the word sesame for its own sake, and irrespective of the 2 meanings it has here, Ali Baba's open sesame and reading, insisting on its original meaning, sesame seeds, and further embellishing it with a quotation from Lucian, playing a sort of game with the word by making the original significance appear sharply under the conventional meaning that the word has for the Arabian storyteller and for Ruskin. In truth, Ruskin thereby raises by a degree the symbolic significance of his title, because the quotation from Lucian reminds us that sesame was already deflected from its true meaning in the 1001 Nights. Thus, its meaning as the title of Ruskin's lecture is an allegory of an allegory. The quotation clearly expresses at the outset the 3 meanings of the word sesame, reading which opens the gates of wisdom, Ali Baba's magic word, and the grain. Thus, from the beginning, Ruskin lays out his 3 themes, and at the end of the lecture, he will inextricably blend them together in the last sentence, whose final chord will recall the tones of the opening, the grain of sesame, and take from these 3 themes, or rather 5, the other 2 being kings' treasuries in the symbolic sense of books, and the different kings with their different kinds of treasuries, a new theme introduced toward the end of the lecture, taking from these 5 themes an extraordinary richness and plenitude. At various times, Ruskin tried out as many as 5 epigraphs for the Sesame lecture, and if in the end he opted for the quotation from Lucian, it was no doubt because precisely by lying farther from the sentiments of the lecture than the other options, it added more, provided more embellishment, and best shed light on the various symbols by rejuvenating the meaning of the word sesame. It doubtless also served to bring the treasures of wisdom into line with the charm of a frugal life and give to his advice for individual wisdom the additional range of maxims on social happiness. So, a few things to say about that. This is good analysis. I mean, we're learning something about Ruskin. This is like the normal thing a translator's note is supposed to do, right? Is it a coincidence that right after finishing the preface with its 5-fold metaphor in Venice, we get a discussion of how the last sentence of Ruskin's essay ends in a 5-fold metaphor, bringing together the themes of Sesame? I don't think it is a coincidence. I think that, Proust is really calling the attentive reader's attention to the fact that he's learning these lessons from Ruskin and doing it himself. And the whole issue that the note goes on to do even more, I only read about a third of it, is talk about how, I guess I do have to read a little more. In reality, Ruskin takes all the main ideas or images which have come up somewhat chaotically during his lecture and sets them next to each other, mixes them, manipulates them, makes them shine together. This is how he works. He moves from one idea to the next without any apparent order, but actually the imagination which leads him is following its own deep affinities and imposing a higher logic on him in spite of himself, to such an extent that at the end, he finds himself to have obeyed a kind of secret plan unveiled at the end that retroactively imposes a kind of order on the whole and makes it seem magnificently staged right up to the climax of the final apotheosis. This is very smart, and this is very sharp about how the sort of total systematic coherence of Ruskin actually plays out and actually gets built up out of the writing. Proust goes on to say that it's working differently in this book than it does in some of Ruskin's other books. And Proust, for his part, is trying to do it his way and come up with ways that he can evince the unity of his own thought amidst all the grab bag of different things he's talking about. So, along with being a sharper analyst of what Ruskin's doing, as I mentioned before, he really does argue against Ruskin about reading, which is the whole point of the lecture and the whole point of Proust's preface. We have to go a little bit into the weeds to get at this disagreement. I'll try not to go too far. But basically, as we've sort of heard, Ruskin's idea about what reading is that, everyone wants to get ahead in the world. Why? Because then they get to hang out with kings and princes. But wouldn't it be great if everyone could hang out with people who are even better than the wisest men of today? And lo and behold, that's what books let you do. Books let you converse with the greatest minds of all of history. And so you're in the best society you could possibly be in, not in your real life, just by reading these books. And so Proust is kind of funny about this, but he's also right. He says, well, sounds good, but actually, some people can talk to kings. And even them get more out of books than they get from talking to kings. So Ruskin's analysis can't be right. One can be in a situation in life which does permit one to choose the friends one wants. Even for those privileged beings, however, the friends they can choose at will cannot in any way take the place of books, which proves that books are not merely friends whom one can choose to be as wise as one wants, because in truth, the essential difference between a book and a person is not the greater or lesser wisdom in one or the other, but the way we communicate with them. And so then he lays out his Proustian position, which is basically that friends and conversation and other people are always a disaster and a waste of time that take you out of yourself and your own task. Books and reading are have this magical property of they allow you to commune with other people but still be by yourself. That's the thing about reading. That's what makes reading unique and special. You get all the benefits of solitude, but you're not by yourself. You actually are getting sort of contact and input and stimulation from other people, but you're not being pulled out of yourself because you're actually by yourself reading. It's a qualitative difference, not just, as Ruskin lays out, that, you actually get the best minds of all of history. It's not just who you get to, have these conversations with. Now, what's interesting is that a little bit later, Ruskin says, the book says, he sort of makes it a bit more spiritual and says a book is essentially not a talking thing, but a written thing, and written not with a view of mere communication, but permanence. At which point Proust adds another footnote and says, this is just what I said. So, maybe I'm not disagreeing with Ruskin after all. In rereading this sentence of Ruskin's, a book is not a talking thing, but a written thing, I feel as though, Proust says, I have contradicted him less than I thought. But in any case, it must still be said that if a book is not a talking thing, but a written thing, it is also something read, not something listened to in conversation, and consequently, it cannot be equated to a friend. So this is Proust. And like I mentioned about the makeshift memory that's not an improvised memory, I do want to just give one little side note here too. Ruskin goes on to say, the book is printed only because its author cannot speak to thousands of people at once. If he could, he would. The volume is mere multiplication of his voice. You cannot talk to your friend in India. If you could, you would. You write instead. That is mere conveyance of voice. But a book is written not to multiply the voice merely, not to carry it merely, but to perpetuate it. Now, Proust adds another footnote and makes the kind of smart point. To perpetuate is there for the contrast. In reality, it is no longer the same voice that is to be perpetuated. If it were simply the same kind of voice, nothing but spoken words, then to perpetuate it would be as pointless as to carry it or to multiply it. So I think this is interesting because it's actually a very smart point, and it makes you go back to the Ruskin and be like, what is the contrast he's drawing? Like, if multiplying and carrying it isn't useful, then why does he say perpetuating it is useful? And this is what I guess I'd say is the second way you can learn about Ruskin, by looking at this kind of translation practice, because I certainly wouldn't have noticed and didn't notice this issue with the perpetuation sentence when I was just reading Ruskin, but Proust calling it out makes me ask, wait a second, so what does he mean? And I think I have an answer, which is that perpetuate has two meanings, or certainly it used to. On the one hand, it means to kind of continue or prolong the same thing, more or less the same, to perpetuate a tradition, to perpetuate the species, whatever. But it also means to, I guess the word we would use is eternalize it, to turn it into something that's perpetual. To perpetuate it is to transform it into something lasting and timeless. And that must be how Ruskin is using it, because otherwise, even in English, the contrast wouldn't make any sense between conveying it and just continuing it. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But what Ruskin is saying is that the book doesn't multiply the voice or convey it, it eternalizes it. And I think Proust missed that. And Proust made the same mistake as his translators. He uses the French word perpetuer, which is sort of only one of those two meanings. It's hard looking in dictionaries to figure this out because the two meanings are so close. To like extend something indefinitely really is pretty close to turning it into something permanent. Like, those are kind of almost the same thing. The OED is not very good about differentiating those. Webster's International Second Edition does give two definitions. One, to make perpetual, to give an enduring character or existence to preserve from extinction, and then two, to sort of prolong or extend. And as far as I can tell, perpetuer in French is only the second one. So he got fooled by the false friend and ended up with a French version where the contrast doesn't make sense, and wrote a translator's note saying the contrast doesn't make sense. But that's interesting for us readers who are looking at this. That's a kind of, very fine-grained, admittedly deep in the weeds, minor bit of wisdom about Ruskin that, might not be worth the trouble. I'm willing to grant that. But that's part of what's going on in the translation process, even when you're going translated from Ruskin to Proust. Okay, let's step back. Let's get out of the weeds. I promised 3 ways that I think looking at this interaction tells us about Ruskin. The first is that Proust is a good critic, and we find out, there's some sharp arguments there. The second is watching the translation process kind of reveals these little distinctions that we otherwise as readers would pass over. But what's the big picture about this collision of these two different worldviews? I think this is probably what's likely to spill over into the Q&A or the discussion with Sarah. And it's hard to sort of exactly wrap up and put a bow on, but I think the issue is authority. For Ruskin, reading is about kings. They're kings' treasuries. And what you need to do as a reader is submit. You need to want them to teach you. You need to put yourself aside. You need to say, Milton thought this, not I thought this while misreading Milton, is what he says after he gives his example of doing a close reading of some lines of a Milton poem. In the very beginning of Praeterita, he defines himself as a Tory, which to him means a deep and sincere love of kings, and I forget the adjective, grave dislike or something of everybody who would disobey them. Ruskin is all about reading as that relationship where you get something from the more authoritative person you're reading. He says elsewhere, you'll begin to perceive that what you thought was a matter of no serious importance. In fact, that unless you are a very singular person, you cannot be said to have any thoughts at all. That's how Ruskin is telling you you should read. For Proust, it's very interesting. Reading is both more powerful than Ruskin says, because it's not even conversations with the very best and brightest. It's like more than conversation can possibly do. On the other hand, he says it has limits. I do not think that we can grant reading the preponderant role in our spiritual life, which Ruskin seems to assign to it, because he has this attitude where it's not the case that we have no thoughts and we mean nothing and we just need to subject ourselves to the wisdom of the great mind who wrote the book we're reading. It's a much more romantic or transcendentalist view where the reading activates our own thoughts. One of the great and wondrous, this is from his preface again, one of the great and wondrous characteristics of beautiful books is that for the author, they may be called conclusions, but for the reader, provocations. We can feel that our wisdom begins where the author ends. We want him to give us answers when all he can do is give us desires. What a great line. We want the author to give us answers when all he can do is give us desires. He awakens these desires in us. Only when he gets us to contemplate the supreme beauty which he cannot reach except through the utmost efforts of his art. So this is very different from you have no thoughts, read Milton and read the Bible. This is saying, because you are emotionally activated and awakened, you want to get in there and understand it, not show your love and respect and your obedience to the king by submitting to be taught. So you know, this can go in a bunch of different directions, and I'll stop very soon and we can take them in whichever way we want to go. But one thing to say is that I think Ruskin would not agree with all the wise things Proust said about the sort of Ruskinian system and how it has all these harmonies and assonances and homogeneity. You know, Ruskin is talking content. He doesn't want to, you know, activate your desire or your sense of harmony. He wants to like give you this information or give you these tools. So in a deep way, Ruskin's is not a kind of literary imagination. You know, I think it makes sense that when Ruskin really wants to give an example of what reading means, he puts on his schoolmaster's cap and walks you through 20 lines of Milton. And when Proust wants to give you a sense of what reading means, he writes a little 20-page novel about being a kid, you know, sneaking up to his treehouse to read a book. one of the other things Ruskin says in Praeterita is when he's talking about his childhood, he says, I've literally never met another child who was so bad so unable to play a part or tell a tale. And this is a kind of fascinating admission. You know, Ruskin is not telling stories. As Proust even says, you know, the whole thing kind of doesn't fit together as it goes along, but he has this great way of wrapping it all up at the end. And that's what Proust takes from it. But I don't think that's what Ruskin would want. He wants to be handing you the parcel of something useful. And that's just not how Proust thinks literature and reading work. Let me stop there. I had some more things that I could say, but I've certainly unloaded enough. And let me stop there and hear what Sarah and you all have to say. Yeah, I saw that note, Sarah. Do you want to say it out loud? Because
I was just thinking that Ruskin's writing is itself often so sensual.
It's true, right? And I mean,
yeah.
Proust got that from him too. And even in terms of, you know, part of what I am tempted to say is that, of course, it makes sense that Proust was a translator and Ruskin wasn't a translator. Mm-hmm. Because Ruskin, you know, just wouldn't bother. Like he would just want to hand you the parcel of the content as he understands it. Like he wouldn't get into this kind of more affective recreation. You know, Proust said, along with the, I don't know English, I know Ruskin, he said, I'm a faithful translator. I want my translations to be faithful like love and compassion. Mm-hmm. You know, and like that's not Ruskin. But I have to say, on the other hand, Ruskin is talking about like you have to like love and devote yourself. There's a very fascinating passage in the King's Treasuries where he says you should learn enough French and German and Greek and Latin to know etymologies of English. It says you're never, you know, it's like really hard to learn another language fully and like it takes a long time. And but you really need to know the etymologies because that's how you can piece together, you know, what the author is really saying and stuff. So in fact, those little tidbits I gave you about improviser and perpetuate are kind of much more Ruskin mode than Proust mode. Like you can't really imagine Proust caring enough to like do that kind of little nitty gritty stuff, and yet he does too, you know. So yeah. you can't make the distinction as quite as hard and fast as this. It is more just like a vibe you get from the two of them. I don't know.
Yeah, I was actually, when you're talking about perpetuate, it got me thinking about etymology, you know, because Ruskin is so concerned with etymology, and he did translate Plato's Plato's Laws. He was translating that. He wasn't a translator in, you know, he didn't publish this or anything. He was doing it as an exercise. But even then, he's really concerned, and I think the distinction might be in accuracy. And that whole exercise with Milton in of King's Treasuries is an exercise in being accurate, you know, looking at the etymology of the words and what Milton meant rather than what you think he meant. Right. And I was thinking maybe that's the difference we're getting at here, is that Ruskin, especially in Of King's Treasuries, is so concerned with being accurate, not so much with the emotion that you seem to be talking about with Proust. I don't know. I was just making some notes and thinking about that, and that whole idea of that word, you know, to perpetuate. I think he does use that word very carefully because he always chooses his words so carefully. So no, it's really interesting.
I went and looked back in a Bible concordance because, of course, if you want to understand what Ruskin's doing with the word, you know, he's getting it from the Bible.
Yeah.
And perpetuate doesn't appear in the Bible. Perpetual does appear 28 times. 11 of them are in Jeremiah. And it's kind of both. there is the sort of perpetual in our present, more active sense of just like constant, repeated. There's perpetual backsliding, there's perpetual shame and stuff like that. But there's also, you know, perpetual covenant, which doesn't just mean like a covenant that we continued. It really means something that is qualitatively different from other covenants because it is in perpetuity. So I mean, that did sort of confirm my sense that he was using perpetuate in a more active sense of transform into something permanent.
Permanent. Yeah, I was really interested by your whole discussion of that because I find the way that Ruskin works with words and the way he talks about words so interesting and fascinating myself. I was really glad you brought that out. And something else that really stood out to me when you were talking about the footnotes and those long footnotes that Proust has in the work on Ruskin. And it just made me think that really that's actually a really Ruskinian move in a sense to do that. I mean, Ruskin's works aren't filled with footnotes quite as long, but that whole accordion structure, and I love that phrase you used, that accordion structure. I think of like Forrest Clavigera, even modern painters. I mean, so many of Ruskin's books are digressive and elusive and associative. He doesn't do it with footnotes, but he moves back and forth. I think of, fours are letters, to the workmen and laborers of Great Britain. And he writes about whatever he feels like, and sometimes, readers they complained that it seemed as though he was being so digressive. He would start a point and then not get to it. And yet he always did. And
well,
like
that's that's the passage I was reading, right? Where Proust says, he can't actually string something together coherently, but at the end he wraps it all up and makes it seem like it was all planned.
Right. Right.
And I really think it's fascinating to compare that to Proust, another, of course, well-known digressor. But I feel that Proust has a kind of fractal structure where, like, no matter how small you look, you get the whole thing. Like, I really feel that, like, practically not even any sentence, any metaphor, any adjective, noun pair in remembrance of things past is like the whole story right there.
Okay.
And it really sort of infuses down to the molecular level everything about the book with this sensibility that's kind of coherent up and down the scale on every level. And that is different from what Ruskin is doing, because Ruskin really does digress in the more literal sense of like, wander off here and wander over there. And like, he isn't doing the same thing all the way through. But Proust has pointed out, he has these techniques of making it sort of retrospectively seem like he's been planning and all.
Yeah, he says about Forrest that he said that his letters grow as a tree does, like organically, and he just lets the roots branch out, and then eventually he's got a structure in the end. But it's not, he says, when he's talking about that book, that it's not planned. And yet in the end, it does come together. And it made me think of, I have a French colleague, some of you may know her, Laurence Constantine-Roussillon, and she's written on Ruskin in France. And she uses this phrase, and you're gonna have to excuse my bad French accent because I can read it, but
it's not worse than mine. So
I don't get to speak it with anybody. So, but she uses this phrase, foi senat manière. So like this, and she says, describes it as a way in which Ruskin's ideas expand and grow from the simplest footnote to an entire outlook on life, art, and aesthetics. And I like that French phrase, but I also like that idea of the way that it grows in association and everything. So I thought that was really interesting when you were talking about that accordion structure. It just made me think of that phrase.
No, I mean, I think that's what Proust saw in Ruskin. Proust saw this is a universe. And I can spend 2 books practicing how you can make a universe seem coherent and how you can communicate that to someone else.
And I just realized that Elena's got her hand up too, and she's been waiting very patiently. I'm sorry, I was getting carried away. Elena, I'm going to stop talking and let other people. chime in.
No, I'm just chiming in because, and I put this very briefly in the chat, but the idea of Ruskin's precision, of course, coincides with his feeling about seeing and about seeing and drawing. So,
Right.
I mean, I saw those two things as sort of in alignment with what with your take on you know, the use of etymology in certain words. And but yeah, those are they both do associative leaps in a way that's obviously very poetic and a little bit different in their functioning. But I think this is a marvelous discussion about not just ideas, but the process, because as you were saying in the beginning, it's how we receive the information as much as it is the information itself. So, and I always tell my students that, you know, how you approach your subject matter is so important. So I loved hearing that.
Yeah, you know, it's so hard to quite put your finger on what the distinction is between taking what we could call a more objective and a more subjective approach. I mean, Proust is not unvisual. Proust is also about seeing, but
Yeah.
Proust tends to pay more attention to the ways in which our own eyes filter what we see. You know, the
engagement, right?
yeah, or the fact that we can't see it unless we have this connection to it. You know, this is what Proust, along with someone like Thoreau, gets from Emerson. You know, Thoreau says all of our observations make a chain, and we can't see the thing that we're not prepared to see. If we're not kind of half aware of it and thinking about it and sort of looking for it, even if we don't know we're looking for it, then we just won't see it. And you know, so much of the love story in Proust is about that. It's about that, you know, we're completely blind to what doesn't fit our preconceptions of what we're looking at. So that's seeing too, but it's totally not Ruskin seeing. Ruskin doesn't talk about that. He talks about like what the, you know, lines of rock in the gneiss actually look like, and like draws them very perfectly. So so you're tempted to say, oh my God, they're totally opposites. And yet, you know, of course, both are somehow doing both, even if they're not talking about it the same way.
Well, I know Gabriel can better describe this because he's talked about it so often, but you know, the difference between consumerist seeing and, you know, or looking at something and seeing something, there's that differentiation that's so important for Ruskin. Yeah. So that's it. That's all I want to say right now. Thank you so much. This is amazing.
I haven't read that much Ruskin, but I have read Proust, all 7 books twice. So I was really interested in, like your lecture made me think about, you know, how just even in the first chapter, all the themes of the entire book are in the first chapter.
Right.
And
they're literally in the first page though. I mean, They actually literally are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then by the time we get to the end, which I was thinking about both when you were describing the word sesame and you were talking about Italy with the 2 lions, by the time you get to the end of Proust, it throws you back onto the whole book again and says, well, now I'm going to begin to do my work. And here we've had this incredible sensory and mutability of the past, which he does. In a way, he proves the mutability of the past in that book.
Right.
And so it was so interesting to hear you talk about the meanings of sesame and, what Ruskin was thinking and and how Proust read that in terms of In Search of Lost Time.
Yeah, all that stuff about sesame there, I was quoting Proust's
Proust.
first footnote.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that was all Proust. Proust is always describing himself no matter what he's describing. And so there he kind of is too. Yeah, so one of the book that I kept looking down at is this book, which is the one that I translated, that has the Ruskin Sesame lecture a little bit trimmed for space, and most of the Proust footnotes to that, as well as the on reading essay. Unfortunately, out of print and totally unavailable, like even used or anything. So
I think I read it 50 years ago.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it. I'm trying to get it back into print. But in any case,
Wow.
one of the other passages that I didn't have time to read, I was going to read from this sort of first half of the on reading preface, the novelistic part, and there's literally a sentence describing the things in his room that goes on for 2 pages. There are 8 clauses, and every single one of the 8 has either church or flowers as a metaphor for something or a literal description. Every single one of the 8. And then the next sentence mentions how his room is really close to the church. They're right next door. And during festival season, where they're sort of bouquets all the way, it's a path of flowers connecting the two. So it's like every single thing, every single one of the 8, like he has to work in flowers and the church some way because that's what he's doing. So
Yeah.
that's, one of the things that I didn't get to, but an example of what I mean by this kind of fractal structure.
Yes.
And
Yes,
and in
that's
fact,
brilliant.
in the 5th line of Remembrance of Things Past, the very first waking thought our narrator has is that he thinks he's a church because he was reading about a church. Like it's all like literally right there,
Yeah. That was so interesting. I came in a little late on the lecture because I thought it started later, but there was something else. Oh, it was really interesting, the discussion about, you can't get anything from listening to friends or common speech. And then that's so, in a way, hypocritical, because Remembrance of Things Past weaves in all these characters
right?
from these big, conversational dinners that are like ribboned through the entire.
No, I mean that's
book.
one of the very paradoxical things about reading Proust. You get 400 pages of a dinner party, and his point is how trivial and useless a waste of time it was.
Exactly. But
And yet we did just read 400 pages of it, and
down to the
wrote
description
400
of
pages of
the
it.
China.
Yeah. So, on the one hand, he's telling us how pointless it is, but yeah.
Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to mention it in the chat. A few people have said that your book is actually available. A few copies are on ABE Books.
Oh, last I knew they were like $900. It was one of these weird.
Oh, that can happen. Yeah, they didn't say what the price is, but
Okay. Well, any case, it's at some libraries too. So if you're interested in reading it in this translation, the on reading essay has been translated a few different times and published in a few different forums in English, but not really in the context of pairing it up with Ruskin like this. There is a book called On Reading Ruskin that translates all the Proust bits, but kind of just gives you snippets of Ruskin as like a location aid more
Mhm.
than really giving you enough Ruskin to really watch Proust in action.
Yeah.
So this is the one that does that.
Yeah, and then now there's in the chat, people are saying that it's $11, $12, very affordable.
Oh, all right.
Everyone can go and
Okay,
get a
well,
copy.
I will take
Um,
back that comment then and
Yeah.
tell publishers that they can get it on ABE Books instead of waiting for me to send them a scan or something. But prospective republishers, I mean.
One thing I was thinking of when we were talking just now and during your talk as well is the way that, again, the footnotes, that Proust uses. He's having a discussion almost with Ruskin in those footnotes, right? He's engaging with the text, he's talking about it, he's talking to Ruskin. And it makes me think of the way that Ruskin says, and when he designs his books, he says, leave a lot of white space because you should be writing in your books, you should be writing in the margin, you should be having this discussion with the text. And when he does design his books, which he's very involved in, he leaves a lot of white space, hoping that people will do that. And I was just thinking that, Proust is doing that. I mean, he's publishing the book, he's publishing his footnotes, but it's a real engagement that's very exciting and meaningful. So,
and also in the same way we were just talking, kind of contradicts his alleged point of how pointless conversations are,
right?
Since he's very clearly having one.
Yeah, very much so. I don't want to start talking again too much. I know that other people here might have a question for Damian. So if you do, you can come off mute. Nancy, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful talk. I was wondering if those chatty footnotes are kind of new in a way at that moment, that they're very so expository, interpretive, and in dialogue. Is that something new for literature at that point? Or
yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I knew. I mean, I guess they feel very original to me in a ahistorical way as a reader. So I haven't gone and done the sort of historiography of what were translator prefaces like in France in the 19th century. Did they do this? I guess it is possible that other translators engage with the text not only so aggressively, but so out in the open aggressively. I mean, I certainly know that our present day ideals of very scrupulous translation, no, you can't possibly skip a bit you don't like or make it sound more amenable to modern values or anything like that. That's totally not what a translator's supposed to do. I know that that is a historically specific moment that in other decades and other centuries, people had very different ideas about about what the translator should do, and cutting out whole chapters or whole sections of the book that seem pointless, or making it all sound more Christian, even if it's Homer or whatever, was completely normal, expected, and desirable, what part of the translator's job, in a way that now it's not. Do you or Nancy or does anyone know of other examples of translators doing this? Because I don't, until you get sort of postmodern, I mean, like Pale Fire or something, once you're getting into that kind of postmodern version. But no, I'm not familiar with any other comparable ones. Are you?
Well, I kind of asked because I know very little. I'm in the medieval world, and I know that people like Michelet are have these sort of chatty preferences, talking about the smell of the archive and the dust that you inhale from the archival research. In the 19th century is when archives are nationalized, they're born. This is like history as a discipline is made. Is made. So I just wonder if Proust is somehow, tapped into what's happening in France intellectually. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the chattiness is certainly uh, it is certainly typical. And, you know, the sort of gentleman scholar bringing you along with him on his journey. In fact, there's the most pull back the curtain moment in the whole on reading essay, which is such a pull back the curtain essay, is where he's basically saying that, like, you can't find the answer in evidence. Like, you can't, if Monet makes you fall in love with a place and you decide to go to that bend in the river, you're not going to see anything special, because it wasn't special. It was just Monet painting it that made it special. And so he gives an example of, like, oh, you think you might find the answer in the archives. So you go up to the Dutch convent where they have the volume under lock and key, and you have to stop in Dordrecht and blah, blah, blah. He gives you 2 pages of this, like, incredible description of, Lars, please don't come in.
I need to charge my phone.
Can you charge it in your room?
No.
Sorry, folks.
Fine.
So he gives this incredible description of, like, going up and to Holland and, you know, meeting with the abbot and getting the volume and all this kind of stuff. Then he says, footnote, I need not add that it would be fruitless to look for this convent near Utrecht, and that this entire passage is pure imagination. So after giving you the whole thing, he says, yep, it's a composite. I made it up. It was, however, suggested to me by the following passage in Léon Séché's book on Saint Beuve. And then he gives a big quote of some other book that has some other description that he used to novelize this, like, journey to look for the truth. So it's this real, you know, like, showing you, you know, doing the cup trick with transparent cups so you can see, you know, what the magician is doing kind of thing, to create this incredibly convincing, like, story of the trip up north, and then be like, of course, I just made that up.
Fabulous, thank you.
Sarah, you're muted. Sorry, what?
Keep doing that. Stuart, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Oh, hi.
You're muted, Stuart.
Yep.
There you go.
Okay. This is a little bit off subject, but as a translator, so deeply experienced, can you speak just for a minute or two about the difficulties inherent in translating poetry?
I could. Well, you know, it rhymes. That's the main thing.
Sometimes. You know, a lot of translators have said that a translation is in many ways a metaphor of the original text. And maybe in part because they're putting so much of themselves into it and you know, reformulating, redigesting. I don't know if is
yeah,
that
I mean, there are a lot of metaphors that are used to describe translation. I guess you know, I kind of see the value in most of them. The one that seems most illuminating to me is kind of the performance one. Like, when you listen to Glenn Gould play Bach, are you listening to Glenn Gould or you're listening to Bach? Well, both. And is Glenn Gould, like, somehow getting in the way of your experience of Bach? No, Glenn Gould is how you're experiencing Bach. There's no other way. I mean, you could play it yourself, but you are perhaps not as good. You could read the score, but maybe that's not as good an experience of the music as actually hearing some notes, you know? And so
you can
the existence of multiple different translations that are different doesn't mean that there's some pure thing that the translators are getting more or less close to, depending on how accurate and good they are. It means that each performer of it is using their abilities to convey what the original is.
It's
So,
it's never
Right.
quite. It's never quite.
well, it is quite. I mean, how else are you going to listen to Bach unless someone plays it?
Well, Lang Lang is actually far superior, but that's
Well, there you go. But
Richter.
okay, but this is the point, right? You're not. There isn't some like mythical perfect communion, and even if you speak French, you're just one of Proust's million readers who are going to read it differently.
Mhm.
So the language difference doesn't create kind of a qualitatively different distance between you and the original than there is just from the fact that you're reading something written by a different person in the first place.
Well, I would disagree respectfully. I think that the language is the poetry, and the metaphor is as close as we can come to understanding how translation works. Certainly the adducing the notion of a player, a performer, interpreting to some degree, to a great degree, in the case of Glenn Gould, Bach, for example, is again approaching some understanding of the difficulty, the degree of difficulty. To me, the language is the poetry, and that anything translated is merely conceptual distillation, and that's fine. That's useful.
Well, I guess I don't think that's a tenable argument for prose. You
No,
could
not for prose.
say that it's.
Prose is just a
Could
different.
really say that it's for. I mean, there's some things that, like, if you're alphabetizing something in one language and you translate it, like, it's not going to be in alphabetical order. There's a linguistic element that you don't bring into other languages because it's specific. I don't ultimately think that poetry is so solely an artifact of one particular language, because of course we read poetry in other languages, and you know, and so yeah, I don't know about that.
Does this bring us back to that question of accuracy versus the spirit of the thing or the emotion too? I mean, a translator, I mean, I'm not a translator, although I'm fascinated by the process, but I mean, a translator isn't just trying to reproduce the words on the page. They're trying to capture something deeper and more profound and meaningful that language.
Well, yeah,
conveys,
I mean,
right?
it's not, you know, these are a lot of the translation cliches, right? That like you either have faithful and ugly or faithless but beautiful is old sexist chestnut for translation.
Also, kissing a beautiful woman through a veil.
Well, that's another one, I guess. But the idea that like either you're making it, you know, nice or you're making it accurate.
I don't think it has to be one or the other. That's what I was saying. I mean, it doesn't have to be one or the other.
Well, I just don't think that's really, I mean, no translator is trying to not be faithful. They're just faithful to different things, and they're faithful to what they've decided is the most important thing about whatever it is they're translating. Like, for example, if there's a joke in a novel, I, for one, would try to have the translation be funny. Like, even if the content of the statements, even if like the logical content of what the person says isn't the same at all, that's not what matters at this moment in the translation. What matters is that it's a joke and it has to be funny. Or if you're translating and you add footnotes, it doesn't mean you fail to translate. That's just how your translation is conveying what you think it's most important to convey. And if you're doing an instruction manual, or if you're doing an academic edition, or if you're doing a language learner textbook, those have different purposes than doing a, you know, mass market paperback novel where like you're not going to footnote everything in 100 Years of Solitude because you're expecting people to just read it. I don't think any translator ever does say, oh, I'm going to make this be less accurate so that it's prettier. It's just they're being faithful to the prettiness instead of being faithful to, the cognitive literal meaning of something that isn't so important at that moment in the text.
Yeah, and you just
And I
said what I
also
was
think-
kind of trying to say a lot better. I didn't say it very well, but I was agreed because Stuart had said that he doesn't think you can really convey the poetry, and I think you can. So I guess I was agreeing with you, but saying it not so articulately.
Why didn't
I was
they-
going to say,
Dialect is another maybe less emotionally charged example of, is it translatable or not? And in some ways, it really isn't, because if someone is speaking Amsterdamish version of Dutch, there's nothing that matches that, because we don't have any versions of Dutch in English. It wouldn't make sense to give him a Southern accent. It wouldn't make sense to give him a Scottish accent. It wouldn't make sense to, there's no way to do that directly. So there's either the more academic approach where you put translator's note, they're speaking Amsterdamish everywhere I have italics or something. Or this is an example that I faced. I translated this writer named Neskio who uses Amsterdamish. And I asked myself, well, what's the effect of this dialect on the reader? In fact, he was writing in the early 20th century. He's kind of a Mark Twain analog figure in Dutch who sweeps aside all this kind of stuffy Victorian formality and gets a real kind of colloquial energy into the writing. And so I decided that if I got that energy into the writing in other ways, I could completely not address the issue of dialect, but have it work and have that be the translation of the dialect. So nobody is sort of spelling words funny or speaking with an accent, but in my judgment, the author's use of dialect is being translated, just in a more kind of amorphous global way. So, that mutatis mutandis would be the argument about poetry too. That like, you're not going to get the linguistically specific aspects in a different language, but you can still translate it in sort of the same way as when you're translating anything.
Yeah, but
You're
I
trying.
think that-
the linguistic aspects of poetry are the poetry. And I'm only going to, first I want to say one last thing. First, thank you very much for going off on this wild rabbit chase through the woods and through the weeds, but also that for me, the translations are very much in poetry, that is, a map, as it were. The difference between a map and a city is the difference for me between a translation of poetry and the poetry. So it's a map. It helps me. Certain words need to be understood. Certainly etymologically, that helps a lot. But I mean, what a wonderful consideration of all sorts of translation problems, solutions. Delightful, absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Another metaphor I've used is a path. That a translator is following in a way, guiding the reader on a path that someone else has beaten for us, but that's not necessarily worse. So like if I'm the first person to walk this mountain pass and I guide you, and then you guide someone else, that third person isn't really getting a lesser experience. It's as the kind of standard metaphor of translation as a copy would imply. In other words, if you follow the standard idea that a translation is, a best possible attempt to copy the original, but you're always going to lose something, then a translation of a translation is going to be 2 steps down and sort of twice as bad as the first one by definition. But if you think about like a guide, then the second person leading the third person won't necessarily give the third person less of an experience, because you're going in the same rhythm through the same landscape. And so, you know, maps and territories, yeah, but if you actually walk the map, then that is a transmissible experience. If you actually walk the path, you know, and anyway.
I was trying to say that, and because you were using the metaphor of musical performance, like Glenn Gould and even I'm not a translator, but I do read French. But I feel like it's very, very personal and idiosyncratic, not just translation, but for example, performance. I mean, Glenn Gould would be at the very outside of how you would interpret Bach. I mean, he's not even used when they teach musical composition, Glenn Gould, because he took his, he took so much liberty. But then if you read what Sviatoslav
Okay, I'm sorry, let me just see if there's any more. I just because of the time thing, and because we've strayed, I've strayed on this path quite far from.
It's been fascinating though. I was just gonna say that it is getting to be 6:45. So I just wanted to see if we have maybe a last question for Damian before we sign off for the night.
Sorry, Kathy.
No, that's okay.
I'm interested in Gould, but.
No, I was gonna make a bigger argument, but that's all right.
Did anyone have a last comment on Damian's lecture or a question for him specifically about that?
This is Eric, and I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Oh, wonderful. Because I can't see the hand where you stick the hand up to say hi. Damian, this is totally off the cuff, but I'm blown away that you translate into Norwegian because that ain't the easiest language on the planet. How did you get
It's not the hardest. If you know German,
Stuart,
it's a sort of simplified German grammar. There's a lot of vocabulary with English. So it's not the worst. It's not Japanese. It's not Arabic.
I don't know. When I listen to it spoken, like when my grandparents
spoke,
speaking,
it's different.
Yeah,
but if you read it, it looks like German. Don't tell them.
Also, this actually ties into Ruskin, but anyway.
Yeah, Stuart is, I think, fluent in Swedish. But anyway, I just had to ask the question. It just blew me away that you.
I learned it from reading, not from speaking. So
okay, all right, thank you.
All right. Well, on that note, I think I'm going to draw the evening to a close, which I hate to do because I feel like we could just keep going. There's so much to talk about. We might have to come back and just give a talk on translating specifically, because there's obviously a lot of interest in talking about that as well. But so I'm sorry to have to close us out, but I want to thank Damian for such a great lecture. I can tell that everyone enjoyed it. I know I certainly did.
Thank you all.
Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Bravo. Thank you.
Thank you,
and
Damian.
Also, I just had a few announcements I wanted to make too before we close. I want to let you know that this lecture will be posted at the Ruskin Art Club YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch it or let someone know who couldn't make it, that it's there. You can visit us at www.ruskinartclub.com. You can subscribe to the channel as well. So please do that. I want to thank Katrina Lau and Joseph Rodriguez for all their technical assistance tonight. Our next lecture is Thursday, January 20th. Same time, 5 to 7 p.m. The title is Necessitous Men Are Not Free Men, The Influence of Ruskin and the Settlement Houses on the New Deal. And that will be given by Grave Reckin, who's in the audience here tonight. Promises to be a highly informative and colorful look at the influence of the settlement house movement, itself inspired by Ruskin, on the politics of the New Deal and on the vision of government as an agent of moral and cultural renewal. So please join us on January 20th. We also want to encourage you to subscribe to our quarterly newsletter. It provides not only information on our events, but also newsletter essays, news and comments from our members. And you can do this online at the ruskinartclub.org as well. And I mistakenly said .com earlier. Sorry about that. It's .org. Membership app information, application forms, and payment options can also be found on the website. And we encourage you to think about becoming a member. So thank you again for joining us tonight. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. And thank you most of all to Damian for being here and for giving us so much to think about and talk about. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you all. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, everyone take care.
Thank you.